Pose 322. Study Session 11. North African Sources. Frantz Fanon. Introduction. In the next 4 lectures, I'll take you through aspects of the writing of some of the major sources of contemporary African political thoughts. In this lecture, we shall examine the works of Frantz Fanon, whom, although not a North African in the strict sense of the word, lived in Algeria during the country's War of Independence and reflected African problems in his writings to the extent that he could be categorized as a North African contributor to African political thoughts. The 3 lectures following these are then devoted to the works of some of the contributors from West Africa: L.S. Senghor, Amilcar Cabral, and East Southern African Julius Nyerere and Kenneth Kaunda. Learning outcomes. At the end of this lecture, you should be able to identify and discuss the main elements of the contributions of Frantz Fanon to political thoughts on the continent. Frantz Fanon. Frantz Fanon was born in the French colony of Martinique in 1925. He devoted a great deal of his writings to the understanding of the consequences of colonial rule on the African psychic, especially in colonial Algeria, his adopted country, where he settled down to practice psychiatry. He equally engaged himself to the task of examining the anti-colonial national liberation movements that sprang up in Africa in the 1950s and the early 1960s, and subsequently led to the granting of independence to many erstwhile colonies. He also tried to make sense of the society that was emerging in the immediate post-colonial period. Fanon perceived colonialism as a form of domination whose necessary goal for success was the reordering of the world of indigenous peoples. Let us together now look at his writings on these issues and events. The National Liberation Movement. One of Frantz Fanon's arguments was that any meaningful anti-colonial struggle must be violent in nature. He believed that the colonial regime itself was a regime of violence. To that event, meaningful national liberation must attempt to meet such regime of violence with an even greater violence. According to him, for the colonized people, this violence, because it constitutes their only work, invests their characters with positive and creative qualities. The practice of violence binds them together as a whole, since each individual forms a violent link in the great chain, a part of the great organism of violence which has surged upwards in reaction to the settlers' violence in the beginning. The groups recognize each other, and the future nation is already indivisible. The armed struggle mobilizes the peoples, that is to say, it throws them in one way and in one direction. As he puts it, violence alone, violence committed by the people, organized and educated by its leaders, makes it possible for the masses to understand social truth. Without that struggle, there is nothing but a fancy dress parade and the blare of trumpets. There is nothing save a minimum of readaptation, a few reforms at the top, a flag waving, and down there, at the bottom, an undivided mass, still living in the Middle Ages, endlessly marking time. It is of course a subject of debate whether Fanon was right to argue that meaningful decolonization and struggles for independence could be achieved only via the use of violence. Now write a 4-page essay on this issue. Neocolonialism. Fanon emphasized a tendency for colonial powers not to grant absolute independence to their former colonial territories, and for the emerging elites in the newly independent territories to be satisfied with an independence that is qualified. For him, this is the source of neocolonialism, the acceptance of a nominal sovereignty by the newly independent territories and the absolute refusal of colonial powers to grant such territories real independence. The consensual force from these territories, according to Fanon, is in the form of economic dependence on the ex-Wow colonial ruler. He therefore called for a second phase of liberation that will seek to remove the burden of neocolonialism and free African and other third world countries from economic dependency on their erstwhile colonial masters in the West. One-party regime and the national bourgeoisie in independent Africa. Frantz Fanon warns over what he considers as the emergence of a class of national bourgeoisie in the post-colonial period. Such a class, according to him, is more interested in inheriting all the unfair advantages enjoyed by dominant colonial interests during colonial rule. Thus, according to him, the national bourgeoisie steps into the shoes of the former European settlers, doctors, barristers, traders, commercial travelers, general agents, and transport agents. As a corollary to this economic takeover, the national bourgeoisie then takes the local step at the political level of introducing a one-party state, which soon degenerates from a dictatorship of the newly emerging local classes of national bourgeoisie into a tribal dictatorship, encouraging nepotism and corruption among the leaders and despondency among the led. As it describes the situation in the early 1960s, the political party in many parts of Africa, which are today independent, is puffed up in the most dangerous way. In the presence of a member of the party, the people are silent, behave like a flock of sheep, and publish panegyrics in praise of the government or the leader. But in the streets, when evening comes, away from the village, in the caves or by the river, the bitter disappointment of the people, their despair, but also their unceasing anger makes itself felt. This party, which used to call itself the servant of the people, which used to claim that it worked for the full expression of the people's will, as soon as the colonial power puts the country into its control, hastens to send the people back to their caves. Fanon therefore calls for the mobilization of the people in the post-colonial period for them to realize that the government and the party are their servants. For him, therefore, the political struggle of the people must not end at independence. It must continue even after colonial rule, or else what would ensue in the perpetuation of dictatorship as pernicious as those forced on Africa by colonial rule. Fanon's Black Skin, White Mask is a multidisciplinary analysis of the effects of colonialism on racial consciousness. One of his other major works is The Wretched of the Earth. Study session summary. Frantz Fanon has emerged as one of the major contributors to African political thought in this century from North Africa in general and Algeria, his adopted country in particular. In his writings, he focused attention on the consequences of colonial rule, the imperatives of the anti-colonial struggle, as well as economic and political realities of post-colonial Africa. End of study session 11. Thank you for listening.